Yes.
Okay. Hi folks. So when breeding dogs, or horses, or cows, or any mammal, the subject of inbreeding comes up. So there are three topics we're going to cover. Inbreeding, line breeding, and outcrossing. Why are these subjects important in breeding animals? Well, in nature, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, the hand of nature plays a role in evolving the animal. So let's say we take a wolf. The wolf, which is the most efficient at catching deer or rabbits, gets to eat and therefore gets to reproduce. The deer, which is the most efficient at running away and has the highest degree of speed, it will pass its genes because it wasn't caught. So those which survive, survival of the fittest. Fittest meaning the fastest runner, or the best hunter, or the most socially adept animal in a pack structure. They get to pass on their genes. Animals which are less fit and less able to survive don't pass on their genes. But in animal husbandry, human beings have taken animals as we find them in nature and we've modified them to be various breeds of cattle, various breeds of horses, various breeds of dogs. And so the hand of man acts as the hand of God. In other words, we are creating characteristics we desire in the animal, and we want to accentuate certain genes and not accentuate other genes. So let's say we have a breed of dairy cattle, and we want to create the highest milk production and the highest degree of meat on the bone of that cow, while at the same time minimizing its resistance to malaria. We're in Africa, malaria is common, and we want an animal that can resist malaria, yet still give an excellent milk supply. Well, how do you do that? You have to figure out what you're breeding that resists malaria, yet will give you a lot of meat and milk, right? How do you create an animal like that? Will nature give you an animal like that automatically? No. So, mankind created breeds, horses, cows, you name it, any domestic animal, by inbreeding, line breeding, and outcrossing. And let's talk about that. Inbreeding is what it sounds like. It would be called in human beings incest. It's mother to son, son to mother, or father to daughter, or brother to sister, or half siblings. That's also inbreeding. And it's as the name implies, it's incest in human beings. Although I will say, as terrible as this sounds, actually incest has occurred in human beings. In Ramses III, he married his own sister. In various kingdoms of Europe, we would see the Queen of Austria say to the Queen of Spain, "Hello, brother, sister queen," because the royal houses married each other, and no commoner could marry a royal. So therefore, with generation after generation of only breeding within a certain family line, it became line breeding, which is to say, it is not the breeding of close relatives, but the breeding of related animals, including human beings. So line breeding means there's an animal in common, a common grandfather, a common great-grandfather, a common uncle, first cousins, second cousins, third cousins. That's line breeding. Line breeding is a milder version of inbreeding. And then there's outcrossing. What is outcrossing? Outcrossing is taking a completely unrelated animal of the same breed and matching it with an animal which has some degree of inbreeding or line breeding, and you restore what's called hybrid vigor. So when you're inbreeding, you are reducing hybrid vigor, meaning that you're doubling up on the recessive genes and you're doubling up on the dominant genes. And while you're fixing traits that you desire, you're also bringing to the surface undesirable traits, and you're not creating the undesirable genes. They're already there. You're simply bringing them to the surface. So for example, let's say the dominant gene is capital B, and the recessive gene is lowercase b. And let's say this is a disease-based gene. It doesn't have to be, but let's say it is. The dominant gene masks the recessive gene, so this gene cannot be seen, because the dominant gene, dominant means it's expressed, it's what you see. Recessive means it's hidden, you don't see it. So in this animal, this gene masks this gene. Now I say I breed two animals, B, uppercase B, lowercase b, uppercase B, lowercase b. Well, I'm going to have a couple of different combinations, but the combination which will be this, lowercase b and lowercase b, will create an animal where the two recessive genes are doubled. And therefore I'm bringing that set of genes to the surface. They're there. But by inbreeding, I am increasing the ability to see the recessive trait, because let's say it's epilepsy. Well, the dog will have epilepsy, because that gene for epilepsy now has been brought to the surface through inbreeding. So inbreeding doesn't create bad genes. Inbreeding exposes bad genes. Now, not to say that's what you should do, but simply put, until the 21st century, even through the 20th century, we had no genetic testing. And the ability to test for bad characteristics, such as epilepsy or degenerative myelopathy or other diseases, was really not present. So the only way you saw the genes was to inbreed. The genes would rise to the surface. You don't want those characteristics, so you would cull. What does that mean? You would castrate the male or do hysterectomy in the female. It would stay as a pet, but it would be out of the breeding program, or a cow, or whatever you have. It would be slaughtered for meat or milk, but it would not be bred. So the 19th century and the 20th century, the only way to get to know your genes, good or bad, was to inbreed. And most domestic dogs, a breed is initially inbred in order to create the breed in the first place. So for example, Howard von Graffeth, the first German Shepherd, was bred to his own daughters, because here is the male and female. We're going to draw the male as a square. We're going to draw the female as a, make it red. We're going to draw the female as a circle, and it produces an offspring. There are a lot of pups. We'll make one pup as the example. It will make her a female pup. Now, from the father, she gets half of his genes. Because it's a male, we're going to draw this in black. So we're going to make that half. One half, one half. Now, so she has half the genes of the father and half the genes of the mother. If she's bred back to her own father, he now is half of this child. So he's both the father and the grandfather simultaneously, right? He's the grandfather because he's bred to his own daughter, but he's the father because he's the sire of the litter directly. So through the granddaughter, he gets half squared and another half squared. So essentially he becomes 3/4 of this daughter, because 50% as the father and 25%, one half squared is 1/4, which is 25%. But this is 25%. And this is 50%. So his influence is 50% as the father and 25% as the grandfather. 50% plus 25% is 75%. This daughter, even though it's a daughter of his daughter, but she's 75% him. Therefore, this is a 3-1 breeding. 3 generations back. So the left number is always the father's side, and the right number is always the mother's side. The mother is a 1, she's the 1, I am myself, I am 1. And 3 generations back. 1, 2, in other words, 3 generations from itself. Anyhow, so the question comes about is how much inbreeding is too much inbreeding? And where do you draw the line? How do you accentuate what you want out of the animal and how do you diminish disease? So along came a mathematician named Wright, and he wrote a formula in 1922. It's 101 years ago. And it was replaced by another mathematician, which is more recent, named Hardiman. I will cover him in a minute. So Hardiman's equation replaced Wright's equation about 60, 70 years later. So for about 100 years we were following this equation and not this equation. And I'll explain why this is an improvement of this equation. But first to cover Wright's equation. The equation says f of x equals sigma of half. Why half? Because you get half your genes from your mother and half of your genes from your father. You don't get all the genes, you get half of them. So that's why it's half. Half to the power of n1 plus n2 plus 1 times, this is a multiplier, in other words, this multiplies by this, 1 plus f of a, where f of a is the coefficient of relation of inbreeding of the common ancestor. So this is already an inbred ancestor. So when you're inbreeding on inbreds, the effect is cumulative. In other words, the coefficient of inheritance increases every generation. But the further back in time, the less influence it has. So in other words, if you go back 1 generation, the influence is halved. If you go back 2 generations, the influence is 1/4. You go back 3 generations, the influence is 1/8. You go back 4 generations, the influence is 1/16. And you go back 5 generations, the influence is 1/32. And that happens to be 1/2 to the first power, 1/2 to the second power, 1/2 to the third power, 1/2 to the fourth power, and 1/2 to the fifth power. That's why the half is in this equation. So the influence of the ancestor is reduced the further you go back in time. So if he's the father, his influence is half. If he's the grandfather, his influence is 25%. So father. Now, I want to cover the term called coefficient of relationship versus coefficient of inbreeding. Coefficient of relationship is how close you are to the parent. Well, you're 50% of your father's genes. But you're only going to get a coefficient of a relationship of 12.5%. And this coefficient of inheritance is half the coefficient of relationship. Why? Because there are 2 allele pairs to create a coefficient of inheritance. You have to have both alleles line up. So we have 23 chromosomes, but there's 23 chromosomes of 2 allele pairs. So that's why it's half, not the full number. So the father is 50% of the coefficient of relationship, but 25% of the coefficient of inbreeding. So we're going to use the coefficient of inbreeding, not relationship. So we're going to say father, 25%. Grandfather, 12.5%. Great-great-grandfather, 6.25%. Great-great-great-grandfather, 3.125%. So as you can see, as we go back in time, the number you have is always half the number above. So the genetic influence is reduced every generation you step back in time, where if you go back more than 5 generations in time, the amount of heritable traits from that ancestor is so small, it's practically negligible. It goes back to this equation. So let's say, let's figure this out. Let's say, for example, we have the following breeding. We have a racehorse or dog or whatever you want to call it named Cedric. And he was bred to a mare. We'll call her mare A. We're not giving her a name because we're not focused on the female side, we're focused on the male side in this example. And they produced a foal named Cedric's daughter. And then we have two horses here. We'll call her mare B. We're using horses, could be dogs. Mare B was bred to this horse. We're not giving him a name because, again, we're not focused on the particular relatives. We're only focused to show the concept. And they produced a foal, which is a male foal. And we'll call her Berta. Or, this is the male, this is the female, this is the male. Cedric's son. Cedric's son. Okay? And this is Berta. But the father of Berta, we'll call him Lonnie. Is the son of Cedric. So in Berta, Cedric is her grandfather because her father, Lonnie, is the son of Cedric. But in this boy, Cedric's son, we'll call him Willie. He's the son of Cedric. Berta is the granddaughter of Cedric. So we now mate them together. And we produce another horse here, which is the daughter or son of Willie and Berta. Now, Cedric is the grandfather of this foal, right? So his father contributes 25% of the overall genes, but is 50% of the coefficient of relationship. So let's focus on the coefficient of relationship versus coefficient of inheritance. So let's say this Willie is 50% of the genes of this animal right here. But Cedric is 25% because he's Willie's father. Over here, Cedric appears again, but on the opposite side, on the female side of the pedigree. And Cedric is now here, this is 50%, but over here it's 25%. So he gets to be so in other words, this offspring is what is called 2-3 inbreeding on Cedric. In other words, he's 2 generations away in the male. Notice the numbers on the left and on the right. 2 is on the left means the male side. 3 on the right means the female side. So he's 2 generations back. 1, 2. 2 generations back on the male side. 1, 2, 3. 3 generations back on the female side. So this is essentially a half-uncle to niece mating. The father of this kid here, we'll call him kid. The father of the kid is the grandfather of his mom. 2, 3. So this is basically an uncle to half-niece mating. So his influence becomes 25% plus 12.5%, 37.5% as a coefficient of relationship, not coefficient of inbreeding, because you don't get all of your genes, you get half of those genes. So if you do that, roughly that's 15%, 16%. So the question becomes, how do you mathematically calculate this without constantly figuring out the percentages for each heritable line. Because you'd have to go back for every number of ancestors as this pedigree goes back in time, and perhaps there are other ancestors which were involved. So we go back to this formula. So let's say we take this ancestor, and let's say he has no common ancestors. He's not inbred at all. So therefore FA equals 0. Well, 1 plus 0 is 1. But let's say this offspring has common ancestors in N1 generation, which means generation 1 and N2. Let's say in N1 the coefficient of inheritance is 1 generation back, or 2 generations back. And then 2, let's say, is 5 generations back. So now it becomes 2 plus 5 is 7. 7 plus 1 becomes 6. So it becomes 1/2 to the 6th power, right? Times 1 plus 0 is 1 times 1. So 1/2 times to the 6th power times 1 is 1/2 to the 6th power. Let's say this is N1 is 2, and let's say this is 3. Well, 2 plus 3 is 5, 5 plus 1 is 6, this becomes 1/2 to the 6th. And let's say this ancestor is 0.1. Well, it becomes 1.1 times that. So, the goal of the equation, sigma. Sigma means in Greek sum of. So instead of writing F1 plus F2 plus F3 plus F4 plus F of n. For those of you who remember high school math, sigma means sum of the series. So instead of doing them and adding them up, you say sigma, sum of all the numbers in the series. So that's what sigma means, for those of you who haven't done this in a while. Now, what is wrong with this equation? What's wrong with this equation is it doesn't predict the coefficient of inheritance. It doesn't show which gene pairs are going to be doubled up on. It shows the percentage of homogeneous genes. It basically shows the statistical chance of having doubled up gene, but not actually the number of doubled up genes. So what does that mean? You have the statistical chance of doubled up genes, but not the actual number of doubled up genes? Huh? Well, Hardyman's equation only goes 5 generations, and not further back in time. Wright's equation doesn't put a limit on the number of generations back in time. So if you go, let's say, to the country of Germany, and you're talking about the German Shepherd, and you go back enough back in time, 150 years or so, eventually all German Shepherds are going to be related to each other because they come from the same initial dogs. And that's true of the Rottweiler, the Pit Bull, the Greyhound, you name it. Any breed, eventually, they go back enough in time, they're all inherent to each other. So if you keep adding even small decimals, 0.78 plus 0.32 plus 0.156, and you keep doing addition of very, very small numbers, you still will end up with a large number. So if you go back, let's say 32 generations, which is pretty far back, you're going to get a tremendously big coefficient of inheritance. But in reality, those animals are not really that related. So there has to be a limit on the number of generations that go back in time. That's where Hardyman's equation is an improvement on Wright's equation. Now, let me cover the most common things you'll see in the pedigree, because these numbers are worth understanding. So now, 2 generations back in the male side, 2 generations back in the female side, is a half-brother to half-sister mating or a full brother to full sister. This is inbreeding, and it should not be done. And in most established breeds, which already breed true, there's absolutely no reason to do any of this. But when a breed is established, this thing is done. Why? Well, let's say you have a father and you have a mother, and the father is a square and the mother is a circle, and you mate them together, and they produce 4 pups. Girl, boy, girl, boy. We're not going to give them names. Now, each of these offspring are half the father, right? And half the mother. Right? And I'm not going to draw the female side because it's the same as the male side. And I'll focus on the males because it's easier to get inbreeding in the males than females. Why? Because a female dog can only have at most 2 litters a year, usually only 1 a year. But a male dog can be bred 4 times successfully in a short amount of time to any number of females and put a lot of pups in the ground, right? So most inbreeding is done through the male line. It could be done through the female line, but it doesn't usually work that way. And that's true in horses and other things. Now, let's say we're in the 19th century, we're creating a breed called the Doberman Pinscher. It created from the Hungarian Vizsla, the Rottweiler, the Manchester Terrier, and the French Bosseron. The goal is to create your stud dog that you can then homogenize the genes on. So as the pups come out looking not any one of the 4 parent breeds, but like a breed of its own. So let's say this first breeding, this is a Rottweiler. And you bred this dog to a Manchester Terrier. Now, this is a complete example of outcrossing, right? 2 different breeds. And that's purely outcrossing, right? Now, these pups will come out all ununiform, right? Because some will come out looking like the Manchester Terrier, the mom, and some will come out looking like the Rottweiler, the dad, and some will come out looking kind of like a mix, right? Now, you would breed sister to brother. You create more pups. Now, these pups are half the father, a quarter of the father, and a quarter of the grandmother, right? And then, because they share the father, I'm focusing on the father, they would inherit these genes, but because they're a combination of both 2 different breeds, you're inheriting the combined traits, which blend well, not the traits which don't blend and combine. This is another brother-sister outcome from brothers and sisters. You would then create another offspring, and this offspring is essentially 7/8 of the father. So it's as if you created him. Now, the concept of prepotency comes in. What is prepotency? Prepotency means the ancestor is able to pass himself forward no matter what he's bred to. So a prepotent male, for example, his genes are expressed where you can say, well, that's a Yoshi son. Yoshi was a famous German Shepherd. Or, for example, that's a Ming von Hausfeld son. So even though he's a great-grandfather, his look is still visible 4 generations later. It's called prepotency. Now, prepotency can happen in animals automatically, but it usually happens by inbreeding. It doesn't happen naturally, usually. So now, we take this offspring, which is 7/8 of the father, and this animal, no matter what, now, this animal is 7/8 of the original dog, which is both a grandfather and a great-grandfather and a father. So it is essentially him, even though it's 4 generations later. And we breed this dog to a greyhound bitch. Now we've added another breed. Our original breed was the Rottweiler and Manchester Terrier mix. And now that outcome has been accentuated where the dog is now 7/8 is bred to a greyhound bitch. Now, Guess what? Will this dog's characteristics outpower this dog's characteristics? Yes. He's prepotent. He's heavily inbred, so his genes will outpower what is bred to. And this is a complete outcross. Then you breed these together, and you repeat the exercise, and until you get to your final dog that you like the way it looks and it's the breed standard you want it to be. And you come up with the reference dog. It represents what your breed should look like. Now you've done all your 4 breeds and you've done it over a couple of generations, and you're now 10 years into your program, and now you created your reference animal. This dog is the ideal type. Now, you will then take your reference animal, let's say it's a male, you'll breed him to a female, which is a cousin or a second cousin. So now there is common ancestors. Okay? And the outcome of this breeding, which I'm drawing here, you'll breed back to the grandfather. So in other words, this is called back breeding. So in other words, a male and a female have a puppy. A daughter. She has a daughter because you bred her to her own father. And then this daughter you bred again to that same dog. And then you bred that again to the same dog. So he's a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather all at the same time. So this would be back breeding. You've now created your breed. So this is how it's done. So breeds are created by inbreeding. Shock. But people hate talking about inbreeding, but in fact, breeds are created through inbreeding. Once the breed is established, though, you can't do this anymore. So now, let's just finish up the common relationships, and we'll maybe you can do this in 2 parts. So 3-3 is a common grandfather, 3 generations back on both sides. The coefficient of inbreeding of this is half first cousins. Why half? Because of 1 common grandfather, not 2 out of 4. First cousins. 4-4, half second cousins. 5-5, half third cousins. In other words, common great-great-great-grandfather. This is grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. So these are the terms you find in the pedigree often. Or sometimes you see the following. Sometimes you see 2, 3. The sire of this dog is the grandsire of this dog. This is uncle to niece. Half removed. And it will be this opposite. 3-2, aunt to nephew, half removed. So, the common numbers are in the pedigree are what I've shown you. What's the coefficient of inbreeding? Well, first cousins, the coefficient of inbreeding is 6.25%. Second cousins, 3.125%. Third cousins, half of this is what, 1.625, right? Is my math right? And so forth and so forth. So now, as you go back further in time, the common ancestor is further back in time, the influence is halved as you go back further in time. But the influence is cumulative. What does that mean? Well, let's say you did a breeding, which is a 2-3 breeding, which I wrote earlier. Now, that means this dog's father is this dog's grandfather. But guess what? That grandfather had kids, had parents, right? He had father and mother and grandparents himself. So therefore, his parents of this dog will be therefore 3, 4. Because he had parents and grandparents himself, right? And then this dog's parents would be 4, 5. So in other words, the inbreeding coefficient is cumulative. In any event, I hope this information helped you. I don't practice inbreeding at all. I just thought discussing it is important because all domestic animals are inbred slightly, which is called line breeding as opposed to inbreeding, to stamp type. Because by mildly inbreeding, you are stamping the characteristics you desire. And without any degree of inbreeding of any kind, then there is no stamping. But if you do it too much, you have inbreeding depression. Smaller litter sizes and diseases come up. So it's a compromise of when to line breed, outcross, and back to your line. Anyhow, I hope this helps you. Thank you very much.